Imagine strutting around in the medieval world, where fashion meant layers upon layers of cloth, questionable materials, and hats that defied all sense of logic. You thought your skinny jeans were uncomfortable? Try a doublet that squeezed your torso to the point of suffocation, and then throw on a hat so tall it could double as a flagpole. So grab your most outlandish outfit, and let's dive into the colorful yet confounding world of medieval fashion, where looking good often meant looking ridiculous. From pointy shoes to fur-lined hats that could house a family of squirrels, let's take a closer look at how people in the Middle Ages dressed for whatever it was they were doing. Welcome to History Lullaby. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more history's quirkiest and weirdest moments. Today, we're taking a fashion-forward journey back to the medieval period, where looking good often meant looking ridiculous. From pointy shoes to fur-lined hats that could house a family of squirrels, let's take a closer look at how people in the Middle Ages dressed for whatever it was they were doing. Picture it. You wake up on a chilly morning in the Middle Ages, and the first thing you do isn't reach for your phone or your morning coffee. No. It's time to pile on layer after layer of clothing. Because the more layers you wear, the more important you are. Yes, in medieval fashion, layers were a sign of status. Think of it as the medieval version of wearing a designer jacket. The higher your rank, the thicker, more cumbersome, and downright uncomfortable your wardrobe was. Now, let's talk about the noblemen, the ones who really knew how to dress in a way that made them stand out literally. These people weren't just putting on clothes, they were wrapping themselves in a fortress of fabrics. Imagine this, noblemen in thick, multi-layered outfits for both winter and summer. And by layers, I mean full-on insulation systems. You could wear more than just your daily outfit. You could be wearing a jacket over a tunic, over a cloak, over a robe, with possibly another layer for good measure. If you wanted to stay warm, sure. But if you wanted to look like someone who could afford to eat, you'd pile on the fabrics and wrap yourself up like a walking, living, breathing insulation system. These layers weren't just practical. They were, quite literally, a fashion statement. But let's not forget about the peasants. The peasants. Poor souls who couldn't even imagine such luxury. Peasants had to deal with basic tunics, and that was about it. It was all about survival, not style. Their clothes were meant to keep them warm and covered while they spent the day laboring away in the fields, not to show off their social status. Meanwhile, noblemen strutted around in velvet, silk, and fine wool that must have weighed as much as a cow. The peasants? Well, they made do with whatever they could get their hands on. If they were lucky, their tunic wasn't falling apart at the seams. Now, imagine wearing all those layers, not because it's cold, but because you have to show everyone how important you are. And by layers, I mean massive cloaks. These cloaks weren't just about warmth, they were social signifiers. The more extravagant and heavy your cloak, the more power you wielded. Cloaks were like medieval business suits. If you were someone important, your cloak practically became your uniform. The rich had thick flowing cloaks made of the finest materials, sometimes so large and heavy that they could probably double as a blanket. Here's the kicker though. Those cloaks? Yeah, they made a movement. Tricky. Ever tried running in a thick, heavy cloak? Noblemen, who were supposed to be all powerful and graceful, probably looked more like someone attempting a slow-motion lumber through a gust of wind. Imagine trying to climb into a carriage, with all that fabric swirling around your legs. If you were a noble, you were likely to take your sweet time and hope you didn't trip over your own garment. It's almost like the nobility decided that being comfortable was too much to ask. Instead, they thought, why move quickly when you can spend your life wrapped in yards of fabric and have everyone know you're important? Let the peasants rush around with their simple clothes. They'll be too busy working to care about being seen. Imagine being trapped in a cocoon of your own clothes, unable to move, but it's fine because you're important. Meanwhile, the peasants were like, at least I'm not sweating in my 50-pound cloak trying to get into the carriages. Yes, the noblemen probably had their own version of a personal butler, someone who would help them with their intricate layers and probably assist them in trying to stand up after they had been sitting down too long. Because, in a world where looking important was the key to social success, Actually being able to function as a human being was secondary. It was all about making a statement, and those layers were as much about showing off wealth and power as they were about any real practicality. And let's not forget that these layers were constantly evolving. In some ways, fashion in the Middle Ages was more about practicality, keeping people warm and protected from the elements. But as time passed, it became more about one-upping your fellow nobles. The more layers you wore, the more you had to show for your status. Your cloak wasn't just about being warm, it was a status symbol. Wearing the thickest wool, the heaviest layers, and the finest velvet was a clear indication that you were not someone to be messed with. You were someone to be feared, admired, or envied. Probably envied, because let's be real, who wouldn't want to wear something so impractical that it could practically double as a bed? It's like the medieval version of flexing. You'd be flexing not your muscles, but your wardrobe. Forget about trying to look strong in a tunic. If you were a medieval noble, you had to flex your way of walking, one step at a time, in slow motion, so as not to trip over your own layers. It's clear. Fashion wasn't just about how you looked. It was about maintaining your place in the social hierarchy. But when you're wearing a cloak that's so thick you can't even bend your elbows, the social benefits better be worth the discomfort. The peasants might have thought the nobles were a little ridiculous. How could you take someone seriously who was so wrapped up in their own clothing? But the reality was, no one wanted to mess with someone who had enough fabric to suffocate a small army. In a way, medieval fashion was like a form of armor, both literally and metaphorically. The more elaborate your clothing, the more invincible you appeared. It was like a social suit of armor, designed to fend off any criticism, and it had nothing to do with comfort or practicality. That cloak? That was your shield. That doublet with the ridiculous sleeves? Your sword. You might not be able to fight, but at least you could look like you could. So, the next time you look at your own wardrobe and think, I need more clothes, just remember, in the medieval world, the more layers you wore, the more powerful you seemed. Never mind that it was completely impractical. All that mattered was how you looked. If you were wrapped in enough layers, you were untouchable. At least, that was the theory. Let's move on to another crucial part of medieval fashion that really took things to the next level: pointy shoes. Oh yes, if you thought wearing uncomfortable clothing couldn't get any worse, you clearly hadn't seen medieval footwear. Imagine a shoe with a toe so long that it could almost double as a weapon, or at the very least, a tripping hazard. These shoes were known as poulaines, and they were, quite frankly, the medieval equivalent of flexing on your neighbors. The longer the point, the richer the person. So, if you were a nobleman, you were likely strutting around in shoes with such absurdly long toes that they could probably wrap around a whole other shoe and become their own separate fashion statement. These shoes weren't just impractical, they were symbolic. The theory was simple. The wealthier you were, the more extravagant your shoes would be. And nothing says I'm important quite like walking around in shoes that look like they belong to a character in a fairy tale, or perhaps an extremely eccentric wizard. Poulaines were often made with leather and sometimes even covered in silk, meaning if you could afford these shoes, you were really doing something right, or at least had a good reason to show off. But how long did these ridiculous toes get, you ask? Well, there are records of shoes with toes that reached lengths so absurd, they almost needed their own zip code. Some shoes had toes extending so far that the person wearing them would tie them up around their ankles, effectively creating a loop. It's almost like they thought, why have shoes that fit when you can have shoes that make people stare, laugh, and possibly trip over themselves? It was as though medieval men were secretly competing for who could make the longest shoe forget the quality of the leather or comfort. It was all about the height of your toes. You have to wonder about the practicality of such footwear. It was hard enough to walk without tripping over your regular shoes. But imagine trying to navigate the cobbled streets of a medieval town, where mud, horse droppings, and the occasional puddle would make it a challenge just to stay upright. Add in a few feet of extra toe length, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Or at the very least, some very awkward walking. Poulaines were more for show than actual use. And if you were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, you'd probably find yourself face down in the muck, clutching the world's longest, most impractical shoe. pointed shoes were made so long that people with normal-sized feet must have wondered if medieval men were secretly part unicorn. And those hats? You had to be careful not to knock them off on door frames or while trying to walk through narrow streets. Ah, yes, hats. Let's not forget the hats. You might be thinking, what could possibly be more absurd than shoes with lengths that could wrap around your entire body? Well, let's talk about hennins. Those towering, pointy hats that were all the rage among the nobility and the church. These hats were like nothing we've ever seen today. Picture a cone that could rival the height of the local church spire. The taller your hat, the more reverence you could expect to receive. The more elevated your position, pun intended, the more you could flaunt it with a hat that could likely knock someone out if you weren't careful. The hennin was, for all intents and purposes, a walking billboard. It didn't just tell everyone you were important, it shouted it from the rooftops. Whether you were a noblewoman or a high-ranking church official, your hat was one of the first things people noticed. It was like wearing a crown, but instead of gold, it was made out of fabric, and sometimes incredibly stiff wire-reinforced fabric at that. The higher your hat, the more respect, or at least attention you got. It was less about fashion and more about power. These towering headpieces were designed to showcase a person's status, and they did so effectively, though not always practically. Imagine trying to fit through a door with a hat that could double as a radar dish, or walking down a narrow alley with your head scraping against the walls. And what about the wind? You could imagine the embarrassment of having your hat blown away in front of a crowd of peasants, all of whom would likely find it amusing that the noblewoman was now hatless in the middle of the street, looking ridiculous. Not to mention the fact that a hennin was often quite heavy, made of stiff materials like velvet, and often adorned with jewels or pearls. But if you were wearing a hennin, you were important. It didn't matter if your head was in constant danger of becoming a punching bag for low-hanging door frames. You were a symbol of power, wealth, and social standing. And while you were strutting around in your fancy hat, the peasants were probably eyeing your hat with a mix of admiration, and I'm glad I don't have to wear that thing. The medieval hats weren't limited to the women of nobility either. Clergy members sported their own ridiculous headwear. Bishops, cardinals, and priests could be spotted with tall mitres, which, while not as pointy as the hennin still, managed to look excessively extravagant for something worn during a church service. So, when it came to headgear, the medieval elite weren't exactly concerned about practicality. They weren't about to make life easier for themselves. No. It was all about showcasing that status, that wealth, that divine right to be important. Imagine walking around a medieval village, with peasants bundled in simple wool tunics and low hats, looking up at the towering figures of nobility, with their overly long shoes and extravagant headgear. There's probably a bit of envy, maybe some quiet murmurs behind their backs. It's like the medieval version of the Kardashians walking through the village, surrounded by peasants who had to endure harsh labor and hunger, while the nobles flaunted their fashion for all to see. It was, of course, more than just about looking ridiculous. It was about sending a clear message to everyone around you. I am important, and you are not. And if you could send that message through clothing, while also causing a few headaches for yourself and your peers, then you were truly living the medieval dream. So, next time you find yourself rolling your eyes at someone wearing a ridiculous hat or an impractical pair of shoes, just remember that medieval fashion was basically the same thing, only much, much worse. The taller the hat and the longer the shoes, the more important you were. But really, who wanted to walk through life in a cone-shaped hat that could double as a roof and shoes that could probably trip you up for life? If you were noble, it didn't matter if you were uncomfortably hot or if your hat kept knocking over the soup pot every time you tried to sit down. What mattered was that you were important. And that's all that really mattered in medieval society, right? It's a good thing we no longer live in that world, where your value was defined by how high your hat was or how long your shoes' toes extended, don't you think? But then again, who am I to judge? If you want to walk around with a hat that's taller than you, who am I to stop you? Maybe we all need a little hennin in our lives after all. Let's take a step deeper into the world of medieval fashion, where the line between practicality and opulence was so blurry, it might as well have been covered in silk and velvet. Yes, while peasants were laboring under the scorching sun, or trudging through the snow in basic tunics and leather shoes. The wealthy were busy outdoing each other in fabrics that were not only impractical but often downright absurd for the activities they were meant for. Enter the world of luxury fabrics like velvet, fur, and silk materials that, frankly, had zero business being worn in the rugged medieval landscape, unless you were simply trying to make a statement. Spoiler alert. That statement was usually, "Look at me. I'm rich and clearly too important to work in the fields." Velvet, that gorgeous, rich fabric with its deep, lustrous texture, was a staple in the wardrobes of the nobility. But let's be real here. Velvet was about as practical as wearing a velvet couch. It's hot, heavy, and incredibly difficult to maintain. Yet, there they were, medieval nobles prancing around, showing off their velvet doublets and gowns as if they were gods walking among mortals. Now, I get it. When you're rich, you want to show it off. But there's a certain level of excess that just begs for a second glance, and not in a good way. If you're lounging by the fire on a cold winter day, maybe velvet makes sense. But strutting around in the summer, with the sun beating down on you like a medieval blowtorch, wearing a fabric that is about as breathable as a stone wall? Not so much. Then there's the fur. Fur was the go-to fabric for anyone who wanted to really flex on the peasants. Whether it was a fur-lined cloak, a fur hat, or even just a little trim around the sleeves, the rich were happy to cover themselves in animal pelts, despite the fact that the only animals they were encountering were, well, dead ones. It didn't matter if it was 95 Fahrenheit outside. If you were a noble, you wore fur. Just imagine how hot it must have been to don a full fur cloak during the height of summer, sweltering under the weight of dead animal skins, just to show that you could afford to wear an animal that you didn't even have to hunt. It's like showing up to a barbecue wearing a winter coat. Sure, you look great, but do you really need to be that extra? And let's not forget about silk. Ah, silk. The fabric of royalty and high society. It was smooth, shiny, and not in the least bit practical. Think about it. In an age when basic hygiene was a struggle, wearing something as delicate as silk would be the equivalent of showing up to a mud pit in a tuxedo. Silk was reserved for the very elite kings, queens, bishops, and anyone who wanted to appear so out of touch with reality that they might as well have been wearing the concept of luxury itself. Silk was like a walking advertisement for I'm rich, I'm important, and I'm willing to endure discomfort for the sake of looking good. It was as if these individuals were constantly saying, not only am I wealthy, but I also have the privilege of being ridiculously uncomfortable. And I'm okay with it. Now, you might be wondering, how did these ridiculous luxuries become the norm for the medieval rich? The answer lies in trade. As medieval society began to stabilize and expand, merchants started trading goods from all over the world, bringing in new materials like silk from the Far East and furs from distant lands. This created a demand for luxury items among the elite. These fabrics were more than just textiles. They were symbols of status and power. If you could afford silk, you weren't just dressing to stay warm or covered. You were telling the world you had money, influence, and a sense of style that was leagues above the rest. It was as much about showcasing wealth as it was about actually wearing something comfortable. But let's be honest, the rich weren't the only ones interested in these materials. As trade routes flourished, merchants and guilds began to thrive, and the once rural, simple marketplaces evolved into bustling towns full of opportunities for making money. The demand for luxury fabrics like silk and velvet helped build these communities, creating a new kind of social infrastructure based on trade and craftsmanship. Merchant towns began to pop up, and artisans started weaving their own versions of the luxurious textiles. Of course, these merchant versions were never quite as rich or luxurious as the nobilities, but they sure helped the average person feel a little closer to the life of opulence. Still, for most people, silk was a dream, and fur was just something the dog wore. The rich may have worn it, but the rest of society just had to deal with their rough woolen tunics and homespun garments. It's wild to think how something like fabric could be so deeply tied to your social standing. If you wore velvet, you were basically a walking emblem of wealth and refinement. Meanwhile, the peasants in their basic woolen garb were silently judging, all the while wishing they could have a slice of that silk pie. But don't be fooled. While it may have looked all shiny and glamorous, that velvet, silk, and fur wasn't exactly the most comfortable option either. The medieval rich were willing to suffer for the sake of looking fabulous, and what could be more medieval than that? Imagine wearing an entire fur coat in the summer. Sure, you look great, but you're sweating through your finery and getting uncomfortable just so that you can show off at the market. Practical? Not in the slightest. It's a miracle, really, that anyone got through their days, especially during the summer months, without fainting from heat stroke. But that was the price you paid for status sweat, discomfort, and the knowledge that you were too important to worry about such trivial things as heat or breathing room. While peasants were in the fields, working tirelessly just to survive, the nobility was out there trading in their sweat for a different kind of status. Instead of putting their hands in the soil or carrying sacks of grain, the wealthy were showing off their silks, furs, and velvet, parading through the streets as if they were walking advertisements for luxury. Meanwhile, the peasants probably just sighed, wiped their brows, and carried on with their day, wondering when the next crop failure would hit. The contrast between these two worlds was never so stark as when you saw the fabric separating them. For the rich, their clothing was a statement. For the peasants, their clothing was just something to keep them from freezing or burning up in the heat. By the time the noblemen had made their way through town, their feet likely sore from their ridiculously pointed shoes and their bodies sweltering under their velvet and fur, the peasants had probably already finished their work for the day, had a simple meal, and were settling down to sleep in their modest homes. The nobility might have walked through the same town, but they were worlds apart from the peasants in terms of lifestyle. Their clothes might have been flashy and stunning, but their lives were often just as uncomfortable and impractical as the garments they wore. But there was one thing the nobility could count on. Their status was undeniable. Whether it was the long, pointy shoes, the towering hats, or the luxurious fabrics, they wore their wealth like a badge of honor, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. So, next time you're complaining about an itchy sweater or tight pants, just imagine being in one of those fur coats on a hot summer day. You'll find that your discomfort suddenly feels a lot more manageable. And maybe, just maybe, you'll have a little more appreciation for the simple pleasures of life, like breathable cotton. Ah, the world of medieval women's fashion. A place where beauty was truly pain, and comfort was, well, a luxury that only peasants could dream of. If you were a noblewoman, you were expected to look perfect at all times, and achieving that perfection came with a hefty price: suffocation. Yes, let's talk about the iconic silhouette of medieval women, where the phrase beauty is pain wasn't just a metaphor, it was an everyday reality. The hooped skirts, those large billowing gowns that gave women the appearance of walking in a cloud, were all the rage. But let's break this down. To get that look, women weren't just putting on a nice, comfortable dress. Oh no. To achieve that voluminous effect, they had to don multiple layers, including a wooden or metal frame under the fabric. These were the hoops that gave the skirt its characteristic puff. While it may have looked stunning in portraits, let's just say there were practical considerations that didn't make it so glamorous. Moving through a crowd? Impossible. Sitting down for a meal? Forget it. Going through a door? Let's just say that was an adventure in itself. And then we have the corsets. The true definition of beauty is pain. These weren't just a fashion choice. They were practically mandatory for women of high status. Tight-laced, boned corsets were the way to go if you wanted to be seen as fashionable. But they also made breathing optional. Picture this: a corset so tight that you could barely inhale, yet somehow you still managed to squeeze into one. Many women fainted from the sheer constriction of it all. And let's not even talk about the internal organ rearranging that happened as a result. After all, why have your lungs and stomach in their proper places when you could look like a walking hourglass? Women didn't just wear these fashion statements because they were stylish. They were social status symbols. A high, tight waist and flowing, hooped skirts signified that you had the luxury to dress in ways that were impractical but visually appealing. It said, "I am wealthy, and I can afford to wear clothes that may limit my ability to move, breathe, and sit down properly." Sure, you might not be able to dance without almost passing out, but at least you looked fabulous while not dancing. To wear a corset back then was like signing up for a lifetime of don't breathe too much and don't sit too low. And the hoop skirts? Let's just say there was a lot of waddling and avoiding doorways that were too narrow. What a fun way to spend your day. It wasn't just the discomfort of wearing these clothes. It was the sheer effort it took to get into them. Women didn't just slip into a dress and go out for tea. Oh no. Getting dressed could take hours, especially when you had to be laced into a corset by another person, because it wasn't like you could do it yourself when you couldn't even breathe. And if you had a hoop skirt, you could forget about running errands or doing anything that required ease of movement. Instead of walking like a normal person, you had to waddle carefully, like a penguin in a fancy dress, praying you didn't knock over anything or anyone with your cumbersome outfit. And it wasn't just the physical restrictions that made life a challenge for these medieval women. Imagine going through an entire day of social obligations, attending feasts and ceremonies, all the while being restricted by clothing that could take away your ability to even sit properly. You'd have to stand or perch awkwardly on a stool or side chair because heaven forbid your skirt touched the ground. It wasn't just a matter of etiquette, it was about preventing the fabric from dragging in the dirt. Who knew when the last time you'd been able to wash those layers was? As for the corset, forget comfort. It was all about that exaggerated cinched waist. But the side effect of having a waist that tight was, well, a multitude of health problems. Corsets were responsible for all sorts of ailments, from digestive issues to rib deformities. If the corset was too tight, you could suffocate, pass out, or suffer from collapsed lungs. But for the noble woman of the medieval world, this was a small price to pay for fashion. Who cared about a bit of organ crushing if you could maintain that desirable silhouette? Surely, your figure was worth more than mere comfort. As for mobility, forget it. You weren't running anywhere in a hoop skirt and tight corset, that's for sure. The idea of walking briskly down the street, head held high, gracefully moving through crowds, that was for people who didn't need to wear their clothes like a torture device. You were more likely to get stuck halfway through a doorway or trip over your skirt in public, which would inevitably result in a massive social faux pas. The modern equivalent might be wearing a gorgeous, glittering outfit that fits perfectly, but as soon as you try to take a few steps, you realize that you can't actually move without getting caught in some kind of fashion disaster. Except back then, you just have to live with that fashion failure forever. Because, let's be honest, people wouldn't forget that time you couldn't gracefully navigate a door. In a sense, the corset was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a social expectation. If you didn't wear one, you were instantly marked as less fashionable, less desirable, and frankly, as someone who wasn't trying hard enough to fit into the elite circles. Imagine walking into a ballroom full of well-dressed women in their finest corsets and gowns, and you show up with a loose-fitting dress that allows you to breathe easily immediate social death. You'd be like the medieval version of someone wearing flip-flops to a black tie event. Not that there's anything wrong with flip-flops, but let's face it, nobody's going to be impressed by them at a gala. While this all sounds absurd today, it was the standard in medieval society. In the pursuit of beauty and social standing, comfort was secondary. And as inconvenient and torturous as it all seems, it was just a part of daily life. No one thought, hey, maybe I don't need to suffocate to impress others. No, they thought, how tight can I get my corset to ensure that everyone knows how important I am? For the noble woman, her body wasn't hers. It was a canvas for wealth and status. Every part of her attire, from the pointed toes of her shoes to the constricted waist, to the huge, uncomfortable layers of fabric, was a sign that she belonged to the upper class. Her physical discomfort was proof of her position in society. It was like a walking badge of honor that screamed, I am important, and I am willing to sacrifice comfort for beauty and respectability. You know what they say, beauty is pain. But in the medieval world, beauty was literal pain, and it wasn't even the kind you could walk off, more like the kind you could faint from. So, next time you find yourself complaining about the slight pinch of a pair of shoes or the fact that your favorite outfit is just a little too tight, remember, at least you can move. At least you can breathe. And above all, at least you're not trapped in an outfit that restricts your every move, forces you to waddle like a penguin, and guarantees you'll be the one person in the room who can't enjoy the dance because you might pass out from the sheer effort of keeping your corset tight. As we leave behind the torturous fashion of the past, let's be thankful for modern clothing designed not only for comfort, but with the understanding that you don't need to literally suffocate to be fashionable. Today, we can wear clothes that allow us to breathe, sit, stand, and move freely. But at least we know, from history, that wearing layers upon layers of fabric doesn't necessarily make you more important. It just makes you more likely to trip over your own hem. Imagine this scene: a bustling medieval town square, with nobles strolling by in their finest clothes, looking like human peacocks, while peasants shuffle around in their rudimentary tunics, barely holding it together. It's not just a difference in style, it's a battle of the classes, a fashion showdown that screams one thing: status. For the nobles, it wasn't enough to just wear clothes. Their entire wardrobe was a spectacle, a living billboard declaring their wealth, power, and impeccable taste. The fabrics they wore, silk, velvet, and fur, looked like they belonged in a royal palace, not a dirt-filled street. These outfits were so extravagant that just walking down the street in one of those garments was practically a public service announcement. I have money, and I want you to know it. And it wasn't just about the fabrics. No. Every little detail screamed status. Their shoes, pointed and decorated to perfection, often made of leather so fine it could have been confused with a luxury brand. Their hats, towering and ridiculous, crafted to announce their social importance from a mile away. They might have looked great for a royal ball, but walking through town in the blazing sun, not so much. You can imagine the sweat collecting under those layers of fur and silk, a battle between looking fabulous and staying alive. I mean, can you imagine wearing an entire fur coat in the summer? The only thing hotter than that would be the discomfort of knowing you look great while suffering from the consequences of your own fashion choices. Now, compare that to the peasants. What were they wearing? Well, they didn't have the luxury of layering silk and velvet like their noble counterparts. Instead, they had coarse wool, simple tunics, and anything else they could get their hands on, usually made by their own hands or someone in the family. Their outfits were born out of necessity rather than style. And you know what? They were damn good at it. These clothes may not have been as pretty, but they served a very practical purpose. Wool kept them warm during cold winters, while the rough fabric helped protect their skin while working in the fields. They didn't have the luxury of lounging around in the sun on a cobbled street, looking fabulous while fainting from heat stroke. No, the peasants were out there, working hard, keeping themselves covered with whatever they could afford. Unfancy, functional, and ready to take on the long hours of labor. The contrast is glaring. On one side, you've got these men and women wearing layers upon layers of fine fabrics, looking like they've stepped out of a painting of opulence. And on the other side, you've got peasants with clothes that have been patched, repatched, and repatched again, all in an effort to keep working through the day. There's a clear distinction between who's important and who's not in the medieval world, and it's written all over their clothes. But the social commentary here is rich and a bit tragic. The way clothing was used to reinforce social standing is as clear as day. Nobles wore expensive garments to constantly remind everyone they were above it all. The fabric, the cuts, the style, it was all a reminder that they didn't have to worry about things like practical comfort or even the physical toll that clothing could take. Meanwhile, peasants wore clothes that made it impossible to forget the harshness of their reality. Their clothes weren't designed for comfort or grandeur. They were designed for survival. No bells and whistles, no patterns or embellishments, just rugged, no-nonsense fabric that would help them through long days of toil. But let's take a moment to pause and think about the actual benefits of being a peasant in this clothing scenario. Sure, they might not have had the luxury of wearing velvet or silk, but they also weren't sweating through 5 layers of fabric under the sun. You could argue that a peasant's tunic, while perhaps threadbare, was much more practical for the daily grind. No corset squeezing your lungs, no heavy fur weighing you down, and no shoes that are so pointy they could double as a weapon. There was something to be said about having functional, breathable, movable clothing. And guess what? No one was going to look at you weird if you had to crawl through a muddy field or pick up a few bags of grain. But then, of course, you've got the nobles, who were strutting about in their thick velvet coats, probably too busy admiring their reflections in every available mirror to notice the peasants around them. And I get it, right? If you spent your entire life wearing such fabulous clothes, you'd want to show them off too. But let's face it, while they were looking great, they weren't exactly functioning great. Think about it. They couldn't exactly run or fight or do much else besides parade around in their designer outfits. Meanwhile, the peasants were getting stuff done, even if they had to do it while covered in dirt and threadbare wool. Now, let's consider what happens when a noble and a peasant actually meet. Picture this. A nobleman walks by, and his velvet cloak swishes dramatically behind him. The fabric gleams in the sun like something straight out of a medieval fashion catalog. And there, in the background, a peasant, dressed in their practical, no-frills tunic, trudges along carrying baskets of food or working the land. Who's winning this situation? Well, the noble might be turning heads, but the peasant, who has no need for a fabulous cloak, actually looks more useful. The peasant isn't distracted by their outfit. They're probably getting things done. Meanwhile, the noble's clothing might look great, but it's just a walking, talking example of how out of touch they are with the reality of life. They can't bend down, they can't really work, and they might faint just from the heat. All the social prestige in the world won't help you when you're trapped in layers of unnecessary clothing. The moral of this fashion story? Well, it's simple. When it comes down to it, being practical beats being pretty. Yes, noble fashion might have made a statement. It shouted, "Look at me, I'm rich and powerful." But in terms of getting stuff done, well, it wasn't as effective as the peasant's humble tunic and boots. And honestly, in the end, who's really winning the life is tough competition. Certainly not the noble whose fashion could literally stop them from moving. Imagine a noble walking through town in his velvet coat, while a peasant in a threadbare tunic stands there, watching him sweat through his finery. Who's really winning in that situation? The noble may look good, but he's probably just a few minutes away from passing out from heat stroke. At least the peasant can move. And that, my friends, is the true victory. So, in this showdown between nobles and peasants, one thing's clear. It's not always the pretty clothes that win. When you're out there in the elements, working the land and hustling to survive, having a few layers of warmth and mobility definitely trumps looking fabulous at a party. Let's talk about medieval women's fashion, shall we? Now, you might think that the idea of beauty and fashion back then would be about comfortable, easy-to-wear clothes. But, oh no, far from it. If you were a woman in the medieval era, your clothing wasn't just about covering your body. It was about displaying wealth, status, and, in some cases, an extreme level of discomfort that would make modern-day Spanx look like a pair of pajamas. Women, particularly those of noble or wealthy status, were often wrapped up in layers of fabric that would put modern-day quilting to shame. We're talking heavy, cumbersome gowns, topped off with hoops and corsets that were meant to shape their bodies in a way that highlighted femininity, at the cost of their comfort and, quite possibly, their health. Let's start with the corsets. A piece of clothing designed to cinch in the waist, giving women that desired hourglass shape, but at the cost of almost everything else. Imagine trying to breathe, let alone sit, when your waist is being restricted by a piece of fabric so tight it could double as a medieval form of torture. Women were squeezed into these things, sometimes for hours at a time, as if being fashionable was more important than, actually being able to walk or breathe properly. But hey, no pain, no gain, right? Then, there were the hoop skirts. These were massive, voluminous skirts supported by hoops made of metal or sometimes whalebone, which gave the illusion of a woman having a bottom that could rival the grandeur of any castle wall. These skirts were so wide that a woman couldn't help but waddle. Imagine walking through a narrow doorway, getting stuck halfway through, and having to ask someone to help you out of your hoop jam. It wasn't a look, it was a lifestyle. But the fun doesn't stop there. Let's not forget the sheer number of layers involved. Women didn't just wear one dress, they wore several layers, each one adding more bulk and less flexibility. From a shift to a gown, from an undergarment to an outer layer, a medieval lady's attire was an onion made of fabric, except instead of peeling it back, you were just constantly adding to it. The more layers you wore, the more important you were. Nobles prided themselves on wearing the most extravagant clothing, regardless of how impractical it was. If you weren't sweating through your dress, or struggling to get through doorways, were you really even important? And now, Let's talk about the highly anticipated fashion statement of the era: fainting. Yes, fainting. You see, in medieval times, if a woman fainted, it was seen as a sign of fragility and beauty. The idea was that the tighter your clothes, the more delicate and feminine you were. Fainting in public wasn't a cause for concern. It was a cause for admiration. "Oh, darling, you look so fragile," one might say, while the poor woman struggled to breathe under the weight of her own wardrobe. "Have some wine to revive your delicate constitution, dearest," they might add. It was all part of the show, a performance to demonstrate that you could bear the weight of fashion and the attention of the crowd, even if you couldn't actually function like a normal human being. Can you imagine being in the middle of an important social gathering, trying to maintain your poise, when suddenly you faint from heat exhaustion? You fall to the ground, and instead of being rushed to safety, you're helped up, handed a glass of wine, and told you look absolutely perfect as you regain consciousness, all because your dress was that tight. You didn't pass out from a medical issue. You passed out because fashion told you that was the way to be noticed, adored, and revered. The pressures of this were immense. Society had a strict view of what beauty and femininity looked like, and women were expected to uphold these standards, often at the expense of their own well-being. The pressure to be attractive, fragile, and ever so delicate was so ingrained that a woman who could manage to faint while walking was regarded as a fashion icon in her own right. But as you can imagine, this often led to health problems. Many women suffered from fainting spells, dizziness, and back pain, thanks to their clothing's restrictive nature. And who could blame them? Who wouldn't want to throw a little fit of fainting every time they stood up from a chair that was designed to make you appear fragile? Can you imagine a medieval woman fainting? Not from illness, but because her clothes were so tight she couldn't even get a decent breath in? And then her friends would be like, "Oh, darling, you look so fragile and fashionable. Have some wine to revive your delicate constitution." Let's not forget that the societal pressures extended beyond the physical. A woman's reputation and social standing could depend on her ability to maintain a certain appearance. This wasn't just about looking good. It was about proving your worth, your family's status, and your ability to endure the physical strain of it all. You might be fainting from heat stroke, but at least your corset was tight enough to show that you were doing something right. To top off this whole look, women would adorn themselves with all sorts of accessories: lace, ribbons, and sometimes jewels. These were meant to show that the lady in question had the time, money, and means to wear such finery. The more jewels, the more rich and highborn you were perceived to be. But let's be real. After a few hours of struggling to breathe in a tight corset and squirming in a hoop skirt, that necklace and ribbon weren't really worth the physical distress. Medieval fashion for women was both an art form and a form of self-punishment. The corsets, the hoop skirts, the layers upon layers of clothing. It was all designed to make you look more elegant and noble. But it was an aesthetic built on discomfort and near suffocation. What modern fashion trends don't tell you is how many times someone fainted, tripped, or got stuck in a doorway because of their outfits. And yet, that's what defined the fashion world of the medieval aristocracy. To wear a corset back then was like signing up for a lifetime of "don't breathe too much" and "don't sit too low." And the hoop skirts? Let's just say there was a lot of waddling and avoiding doorways that were too narrow. What a fun way to spend your day. It's no wonder that many women of the time, despite their fashionable appearances, often felt the toll of such strict clothing on their health. Tight corsets could lead to rib deformities, breathing problems, and even organ displacement. But none of that mattered if you could stand tall and look delicate. Of course, let's not forget the luxury of sitting down. That was nearly impossible in a hoop skirt, especially if you wanted to maintain the correct posture for aristocratic society. If you wanted to sit, you had to employ a special technique. Lean to one side, hold your skirt in place, and pray your corset didn't decide to cut off your circulation. As we look back at medieval women's fashion, it's easy to laugh at the ridiculousness of it all, at how beauty and status were so intricately tied to discomfort and near suffocation. But it also serves as a reminder of how far we've come in terms of fashion and body autonomy. Today, women can choose what they wear without fear of being judged for fainting from tight clothes. and thank goodness for that. Because let's be honest, no one wants to be that woman who faints at the dinner table just because her corset was too tight. All right, let's talk about accessories. Because we all know that when it comes to fashion, it's all about the little things. You can wear the finest fabric, the most expensive silks, and still, if you don't have the right accessories, you're missing that extra touch that says, I'm important, and I want everyone to know it. Well, in medieval times, accessories were basically the medieval equivalent of a modern designer bag. They told you who was rich, who was powerful, and who could afford to pay someone else to dress them in something that screamed luxury. Now, let's start with jewelry. Oh yes, jewelry was a big deal in the medieval world. It wasn't just for decoration, it was a statement. If you were wealthy, you were probably adorned in gold, silver, and precious gemstones that sparkled in the light and dazzled the poor peasants who were lucky if they had one wooden spoon to share between their entire family. Rings, brooches, and necklaces were worn to make sure that anyone who passed by could immediately tell, this person is not poor. Jewelry was especially important for the nobility, who saw it as a way to display their wealth and power. Look at my giant ruby, a noble might say, as they flaunted their accessories with a smug grin. While a peasant struggled to gather enough food for the day, it wasn't just about looking good. It was about sending a message to the world that you were in charge. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Wearing the right accessories was like wearing a sign that said, I'm a big deal. And if you didn't have jewelry, well then you were pretty much invisible, relegated to the role of the help. Moving on to gloves. Now, gloves might not seem like much, right? But in the medieval world, they were a huge deal. Imagine this. While peasants were lucky to have one, maybe two, pairs of shoes, the nobles were slipping their hands into gloves made from the finest leather and adorned with fancy stitching or even gold embroidery. A nobleman's gloves weren't just for warmth. They were a statement. They said, I can afford to cover my hands in luxury, just as I can afford to sit around all day in my fabulous velvet cloak doing nothing. On the other hand, peasants, who worked from dawn till dusk in the fields, didn't have the luxury of gloves. They were too busy trying to scrape together enough grain to feed their families. Gloves were a sign of wealth and comfort, and only the rich could afford them. Imagine how much cooler you'd look if you could wear gloves made from soft, supple leather while your hands were warm and stylish, all while everyone else around you was struggling to keep their fingers from freezing off. It's like wearing a $1,000 watch. But instead of telling time, it's telling the world, look at me. I'm important, and I don't have to work in the freezing cold. And then, of course, there were the hats. Hats were the cherry on top of any noble ensemble. The more elaborate and extravagant your hat, the more important you were. Some nobles wore hats that could have been mistaken for small tents. Seriously, tall, pointy hats that were just a bit too much. They weren't just for protecting your head from the sun or rain. They were about showing everyone in the room just how much money and status you had. The height of the hat often indicated the wearer's rank. The higher the hat, the higher the social status, simple as that. These hats were so massive that if you were an average person walking through a crowded street, you'd have to navigate carefully to avoid being knocked out by the next guy's towering headgear. You could have an argument in the marketplace, and instead of shaking your fist at someone, you'd probably just knock them unconscious with your hat. A little ridiculous, sure, but that's medieval fashion for you. But it wasn't just the nobles who knew how to accessorize. No. Even the lower classes had their ways of showing off within their means, of course. A peasant might not be able to afford a shiny gold ring or a velvet cloak, but they might have a hand-carved wooden comb or a simple wool scarf they could wear proudly. These weren't just practical items. They were personal touches that added a bit of flair to an otherwise drab life. In a world where every day was spent working in the dirt and sweat, even the smallest accessory could serve as a symbol of personal dignity. It was their way of saying, I may not have riches, but I have something that's mine. While peasants were lucky to have one pair of shoes, the nobles were wearing gloves made from the finest leather that could afford them both warmth and a look-at-me factor. It's the medieval version of wearing a $1,000 watch, just to tell time. But back to the nobles. Let's talk about their accessories for a moment longer. They didn't just stop at gloves and hats. Oh no. Accessories for the upper crust were all about the details. Shoes weren't just shoes. They were pointy shoes, as long as you could manage. The longer the point, the richer and more fashionable you were. These weren't shoes you could wear for comfort, oh no. They were a statement, even if it meant tripping every time you tried to walk across the cobblestone street. Nobles wore shoes that could stretch out a good 12 inches beyond their toes, because why not show the world just how much you could afford to be impractical? And the belts. Don't even get me started on the belts. These weren't your average leather straps to hold up your pants. No. These belts were usually adorned with massive gold buckles and fancy gemstones that probably weighed more than the tunic they were paired with. If you didn't have a hefty buckle glinting in the sunlight, were you really a noble? Probably not. So, as ridiculous as it sounds now, these medieval accessories weren't just for practicality or style. They were a very deliberate way to distinguish the haves from the have-nots. They made sure the world knew who was at the top and who was at the bottom. All those extra details, whether it was the shape of your hat, the length of your shoes, or the sparkle of your jewelry, served as an unspoken language that only the elite could speak fluently. The more unnecessary, the better. After all, what's fashion without a little extravagance? The peasants, of course, didn't have the luxury of such fashion statements, and frankly, they probably didn't care. They were too busy trying to survive the daily grind to worry about how pointy their shoes were. But even without the luxury of hats, belts, and jewel-encrusted accessories, they managed to make do. They might have had simpler versions of those same accessories, like a small wooden comb or a worn-out cloth cap. But they had something that the nobles often lacked: practicality. While the nobles were busy trying to outdo each other with their latest fashionable excess, the peasants were getting by, making what they had work, and focusing on the essentials. While peasants were lucky to have one pair of shoes, the nobles were wearing gloves made from the finest leather that could afford them both warmth and a look-at-me factor. It's the medieval version of wearing a $1,000 watch just to tell time. In the end, accessories in the medieval period weren't just things to wear. They were tools of social classification. Whether you were a noble or a peasant, what you wore or didn't wear told the world everything it needed to know about your place in society. The rich piled on layers, jewelry, and pointy shoes to make sure no one forgot their status. The peasants, on the other hand, wore what they could, making sure they could live another day, and maybe looking a little sharper with that hand-carved comb. But hey, in the grand scheme of things, accessories or not, at least the peasants could walk freely without worrying about whether their shoes would make it past the doorframe. Medieval fashion, where the gender lines in clothing were clearly drawn. But both men and women were equally subjected to the discomforts of excessive layers and impractical styles. While women often get the reputation for enduring the worst of the restrictive fashion trends, let's not forget that the medieval man was also trapped in a world of tight-fitting, itchy, and downright inconvenient attire. And trust me, it wasn't all tunics and free movement for them either. Men had to suffer too, although to be fair, they didn't have to squeeze themselves into corsets or hooped skirts. But their fashion challenges were no less ridiculous. First, let's take a look at what men wore in the medieval world. While the women were busy with their waist-crushing corsets and voluminous dresses, men were dealing with their own set of sartorial nightmares. Starting with tunics, long flowing garments that were often so wide and heavy they could practically double as a tent. But it wasn't just about bulk, oh no. There were layers upon layers of fabric. If you were a noble, you had velvet, silk, and wool, which were great for making a statement. But those materials didn't come with a built-in function to keep you cool. No, these layers were meant to display wealth, not to allow for any real movement. So, men of high status often waddled around in a glorified cocoon, their clothes so heavy that movement was a bit of a challenge. Let's not forget the shoes. The aforementioned pointy shoes that were supposed to signify wealth, yeah, men wore those too. The longer the toe, the richer you were. But again, these weren't shoes made for comfort. Oh no. You could imagine the back pain that came with wearing footwear so stiff that you could barely walk without losing your balance. And to make matters worse, these shoes weren't exactly the most practical for running from danger, fighting in battles, or, well, walking on uneven cobblestone streets. It's no wonder medieval men often looked so angry. It was probably because they were stuck wearing shoes that would make a ballerina envious of their toe flexibility. And don't get me started on the hats. Medieval men often wore headgear that could rival the height of their female counterparts' towering headdresses. The taller the hat, the more important you appeared. And yes, just like the ladies' hats, these weren't made for practicality. If you're envisioning a man with a tall, pointed hat that's roughly the size of a small tent, you're on the right track. Imagine trying to fit through a doorway with that thing on. Or worse, having to navigate through a crowded street with your friends and family, avoiding your giant hat like it's a weapon. What did these hats signify? Wealth, prestige, and a complete disregard for headspace. Because who needs to move freely when your hat says you're important? Now, let's get into the gendered aspects of clothing. Women were expected to wear dresses that covered nearly everything. A modest, flowing gown was the standard. Anything more revealing, and you'd risk being accused of indecency, or worse, witchcraft. Their clothing was designed to restrict and emphasize their place in society, where they were expected to be dutiful wives and mothers. As a result, corsets and tight lacing came into play. These weren't just for beauty, they were supposed to convey femininity and status. Imagine having to wear something so tight that breathing became a luxury. Women's fashion, much like their role in society, was built on constraint. On the flip side, men were expected to wear tunics, and their clothing was typically more practical, except for the pointy shoes, of course. But as time passed, men's fashion started to evolve, and they began to wear more elaborate and prestigious clothes. This meant more decoration, more layers, and a definite push for looking as noble as possible. It's funny how men went from wearing simple tunics to the point where they were wearing tights and padded doublets. Yes, tights, like a medieval superhero costume, but with none of the flexibility. Talk about a downgrade from armor. Humorous observation. Men in medieval times weren't immune to strange fashion either. Can you imagine wearing tights under your tunic? And don't get me started on pointy shoes. You'd have to start practicing ballet just to keep your balance. No wonder medieval men were so angry all the time. So, there you have it. A clothing system built on layers of social commentary, where men were trying to outdo each other with more intricate, elaborate designs, while women were struggling to breathe in corsets that could barely allow them to function. It was all about proving one thing: power. The higher the hat, the longer the shoes, the more extravagant the outfit. It was all a reflection of your position in the pecking order. Interestingly, medieval fashion didn't just stop at looking important. It also worked as a method of control. The rich dressed to show that they had money and status. The poor dressed to survive. There wasn't much room for individuality. If you were a peasant, you wore whatever scraps you could find. The nobility, on the other hand, took their fashion seriously. So seriously, in fact, that the peasants probably looked at them and thought, "I'll never wear those pointy shoes, but I sure hope they fall down a few times while I'm wearing my sturdy boots." It's easy to see why medieval fashion had such a strong impact on society. Clothes weren't just for warmth or protection. They were a constant reminder of who was who in the social hierarchy. And with all those layers, hats, and tight shoes, one could argue that medieval fashion was also a form of torture. But hey, at least they were all in it together. If you've ever struggled to walk down the street in pointy shoes, imagine having to navigate a medieval market in full regalia, trying to balance on uneven streets and dodge the occasional puddle, all while trying to look regal. Now that's some serious dedication to style. In the end, medieval fashion tells a story of class, gender, and the lengths people would go to in order to show their worth. The rich piled on layers, furs, and hats to show they were above it all, while the poor worked the land in practical, sometimes ragged, clothing. Men and women alike were caught in the trap of fashion, but for very different reasons. And at the heart of it all was the belief that your clothing could tell the world who you were, even if it meant sacrificing comfort, mobility, and basic human dignity. So, next time you're getting dressed, just remember, it could be worse. You could be struggling to breathe in a corset or wearing shoes that are longer than your actual feet. Medieval fashion may have been a nightmare for comfort, But at least it was a statement. As we step back and look at the absurdly layered, pointy-shot, and corset-crushing world of medieval fashion, it's hard not to laugh. The peasant in their tattered tunic, and the nobleman with his velvet robe and 12-inch hat couldn't have looked more different. Yet, what's truly fascinating is how, despite all the discomfort and impracticality, medieval fashion was not just a game of vanity. It was a tool of power, survival, and social structure. Medieval clothing was far more than just what people wore to look good. Though, let's be real, some of it was pretty ridiculous. It was about establishing who you were, where you stood in society, and, in many ways, what your worth was. Nobles adorned themselves in layers upon layers of costly materials. Silk, velvet, fur, all designed not for comfort, but to scream, "I have wealth, I have status, and I am untouchable." Meanwhile, peasants wore whatever they could, often one size too small or hand-me-down from the previous generation, focused more on practicality than pride. Yet even in the world of the poor, fashion had meaning. The simplicity of their garb spoke volumes about their daily struggles, their labor, and the constant fight for survival. While they couldn't afford elaborate fabrics or designs, their clothes were functional, designed to help them carry out the endless work required to feed their families and survive the brutal elements. And the women! Oh, the women with their corsets, hoop skirts, and layers of fabric. While the men strutted around in pointy shoes and towering hats, the ladies were held hostage by their own clothing, squeezed into corsets that would make modern waist trainers look like a walk in the park. Fashion for women wasn't just about beauty. It was a constant struggle for breath and balance. A medieval woman would faint from the discomfort of her clothing and would be considered fragile and delicate. Oh, how lovely. But not before being swooned over for the sheer feminine charm of it all. But let's not forget that all this excessive fashion had a purpose beyond just flaunting wealth. It was a statement of one's place in society. The more intricate your costume, the more significant your role. Clothing was a social contract, a visual contract that said, "I am noble and untouchable," or "I am a peasant. Please don't notice me too much." The social commentary embedded in their clothes couldn't be clearer. These were the original power suits, but with much more chafing and a lot fewer pockets. Fashion during the medieval period was deeply rooted in the culture of survival. Those nobles may have been sweating buckets under their velvet cloaks, but they wore them proudly, not just to keep warm, but to show that they were untouchable, that they had wealth beyond measure. Meanwhile, the peasants wore simple tunics that got them through the day. Their clothing speaking not of wealth, but of endurance, practicality, and the constant push to simply survive another year of hard work. And when we look at this fashion, with its impracticality and absurdity, we can laugh at how ridiculous it seems from a modern perspective. But it's also important to recognize how these trends and traditions shape the way we think about clothing and fashion today. We may laugh at pointy shoes and towering hats, but these medieval trends set the foundation for how fashion would evolve in the coming centuries. Clothing became not only an expression of identity, but also a status symbol, just like it is now. Today's designer labels and fashion-forward trends may not involve shackling ourselves in a corset or sweating in a velvet cloak, but the roots of these modern-day practices were planted in the medieval period. What we wear is still a reflection of who we are, whether it's a casual hoodie or a power suit. So, as we sit here in our comfy clothes, perhaps sipping a cold drink and enjoying the convenience of modern life, it's essential to take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Next time you struggle to decide whether or not to wear a button-up shirt to dinner, remember that in medieval times, your wardrobe might have been the deciding factor in whether or not you lived to see another season. And let's be thankful for all those medieval peasant struggles and noble discomforts, because somehow, their fashion choices helped create the clothes we wear today. We've come a long way from medieval clothing, and though we don't have to wear pointed shoes that could double as weapons, we can still look back and chuckle at how people once suffocated themselves for the sake of looking good. So, the next time you're flipping through your closet, wondering if you really need that third pair of shoes, just think back to those medieval folks and their 12-layer cloaks, and remember, they were probably just as confused about fashion as we are today. Next time you find yourself struggling with fashion choices, Be grateful that you don't have to squeeze into a corset or waddle through a crowd in a 10-foot wide skirt. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval fashion, don't forget to subscribe, give us a like, and leave a comment about your favorite piece of medieval attire. And remember, when it comes to comfort, we've come a long way. But let's not forget the ridiculous history that got us here.